Hello, welcome to that another episode of Lessons from a Podcaster. Today here with me, Arnold. Welcome to the show.
Tiago, thank you for having me.
It's all the pleasure is all mine. You once interviewed a journalist that got access to relics that were left in the towers after the 9/11. Tell me more about that.
Yes, Henry Louis Weiler is a photojournalist, internationally known, was given access to the museum to photograph some items that were recovered from the Twin Towers. And he was doing this for National Geographic. And he took those photos. He also had a display in a studio in New York City. And the whole display was called Sacred Dust because some of the dust that was left over that they put back into the containers was most likely human remains. And he was very reverent. He was very um, concerned that everything got back in and was careful. He treated them respectfully, all of the items that he was photographing, and he did them in a manner that was displaying the power of what had happened and the thought of what is around and accompanying these particular items.
It must have been quite an impactful interview. Would you say it was one of the most impactful
It
interview
was
you
it
did?
was a very impactful and a very emotional interview on Henry's
Mhm.
part and on my part, because you start getting into somebody's psyche and somebody's feelings that have happened in a moment like that, and you're really opening up somebody's inner core of what's going on.
Yeah. What is your advice for someone conducting such an interview? Because sometimes you know already, right, that the guest is coming to tell about such a story. You can prepare yourself,
Mhm.
But sometimes guests just tell you stories that you are not. They are very dramatic. They are very personal, but you were not expecting that. What is your advice to react to such a story and to tell that story as well for you for the listeners?
Well, I would say the first thing is to allow a guest to speak and listen intently, but allow your emotion to come through too, because that when Henry said a couple things, there was silence on our end because we were dealing with what we were hearing. And it's just a very emotional kind of moment. And so I think being real in the moment and not trying to, brush that off and be fake, I think it gives credibility to who you are as an interviewer and who you're interviewing and to your podcast in particular.
This is very good advice. Sometimes we are just focused on the next question, right? That
Mhm.
we forget to be real and be in the moment and listen. And that also, those pauses, a lot of people will think, okay, I need to come up with a question. But no, those pauses are important as well. They
Yes.
build suspense, you can really feel the atmosphere of what's going on in the room, right? So
I think that's a
that's,
great point. If you can
mhm,
feel the atmosphere in an audio presentation, you're doing very well.
yeah. Arnold, what is your podcast about? If someone approaches you in a party and asks you like, "Hey, what's your podcast about?" You have like 30 seconds. What should you say?
St. Louis In Tune is actually a radio show that we post on a podcast platform, and the radio show is about things that interest me that I'm reading. So events could be current events, could be past events, or some issues that are going on locally, nationally, or internationally that I feel that individuals would want to know a little bit more information about.
What is the difference? I hear this a lot. There's podcasters and people that have a podcast in a radio, right? What is the biggest difference between those two?
I don't know that there's a large difference, Tiago. There are some times I will cut the show and just place the interview on the podcast. So you don't get all the jokes or you don't get all the banter with the co-host in the front end because the interview stands alone by itself, and I don't want to distract from that. And then sometimes you include the whole thing because it's just an accumulation with the guest, and we're all having a good time. And so I think that's something that individuals would enjoy hearing.
Yeah, I feel that when it's a podcast, maybe there's more attention to the audio, whereas that in the radio things can be a little bit more chaotic. I don't know. It depends also on the radio, right? But
Especially if it's a live radio show, which
yeah, definitely.
which we were, and now we're kind of recording. We still do live radio, but that always you have something that throws a curve at you.
What do you have any funny live stories? There's something that didn't go well. Like, how do you react to that? Or, but yeah, do you have any interesting story
You
for that?
always well, Sometimes phone calls failed. Phone calls were bad. Sometimes fire alarms went off. Uh, you have to kind of roll with the punch. You maybe your interview with somebody doesn't go very well, and you need to have extra material prepared to not fill the time, but make sure that you're giving people who are listening something of quality to listen to. So all those kinds of things have happened before. A co-host almost fell out of a chair when I presented a joke. She thought it was so funny. She just literally almost fell out of her chair.
Wow, that must have been a great joke.
It was a funny show.
When did you start this?
We started 7 years ago, and we've just begun our seventh year. So we're kicking things off and enjoying ourselves along the way.
Wow, 7 years. Do you remember your first episode?
I do remember the first episode, and there's kind of a funny story there. Is I thought the show started at 1 o'clock, and I get a call about 3 minutes to 11 from the co-host, who is the general manager of the station, saying, "Where are you?" I said, "Well, it starts at 1 o'clock," and she said, "No, it doesn't. It starts at 11." So I
Ooh.
jumped in my car and literally flew over to the station, which was probably about 5 minutes away, but I think I made it in about four, and got everything out, and we had our first show.
Wow, that was a rocky start,
That was a very
but
rocky start.
almost getting fired in the first day of the
That's
job.
exactly right. Yeah, this is the first and last show.
And what is your stack? So how do you go? You clearly like more stories and history. I mean, what is the how do you go from idea to then publishing the episode? Like tell us about your whole stack.
The whole process is I'll read something, I'll hear something, I'll see something that perks my interest. I contact the source, either email or phone. They either respond or they don't. If they'd be interested in discussing, set a time and a date. I send them some questions, kind of indicate we're going to have a conversation in the living room. No gotcha questions. I have my research that I've done before I go into the interview. We have the interview, make them feel comfortable before we go on the air. Uh, if they're in person, it's even better. Then after the interview's over, we do some auditing or audio editing.
What
I'll
software do you use for the editing?
I use Odyssey and Descript, and then I run that through PodSqueeze and get some show notes, get some titles, some social media posts. I'll get a picture that I want to put on for that particular podcast, put it on Captivate, which is the platform I use, and then send some things out through social media.
What is Captivate? Is it your host provider?
Captivate is the host provider, yes.
Okay. And what do you have any tips for someone that's trying to grow their podcast? Like, what is the best way to then repurpose their content and share it on social media?
I think having a good audio, first of all, having a good content, number one, having good audio because people don't like to listen to poor audio, cleaning that up the best you can. Finding there's a lot of platforms out there, but finding something that works for you. If you have a limited budget, there's some free things out there that you can utilize, and then publicizing on social media and going after that repeatedly. That's something I need to get better at, is updating social media a little bit faster. There's only one of me. I do all of those things. I do the editing, I do the social media, I do all of that, posting on the podcast platform. We don't have a group of people behind me that's doing all that work.
Yeah, that is getting a bit easier these days with AI and all these tools, but it's still a lot of work. What
Yes.
is your favorite social media?
I would say Instagram does well, and Facebook does well. Those are the things that I've seen have gotten a lot more uh, maneuvering and understanding of what we're doing on social media.
Yeah, definitely. I see a lot of podcasters using Instagram too. Um, what is the? You already told us a great story of one memorable moment you had in your podcast. Do you have more? Something interesting that kind
There's
of changed a little bit your perspective in life, or you learned a
oh,
lot from it.
let's see. I talked to a man who was 98 years old, who was a sailor on the USS Missouri when the Japanese signed the surrender, and he observed that.
Oh,
He was on the ship at the time and talked about that. About 6 months after that, he passed away. there was a local murder that happened, and we had the attorney who was defending the client in the murder, and uh, the person who actually committed the murder wasn't even considered a suspect, and so he got his client off eventually. And this was on Dateline NBC and things like that. And Joel Schwartz was the attorney for the Betsy Faria murder, and he just had some, it was unbelievable kinds of things that were happening in the legal system in that particular location. And then I recently interviewed a woman who uh, she's the program director for a museum, and one of the exhibits in the museum is about a woman who saved 2,500 children during the Holocaust. And
Whoa.
she met her and was able to do some a play with her and a book with her, and so that was very powerful too, because those are a lot of these things you don't get the intricacies of because there's not a lot of time. And that's what I think I like about the radio show, and then putting that on the podcast platform.
Yeah, I always feel the same. I always feel that I would like to spend more time, hours just speaking with, especially when you have very interesting people, and it's hard. It's hard to
Yes.
keep the episode short. Um, why do you like this so much? Why do you like podcasting so much? And how has this kind of changed your life for the past 7 years? The Arnold of 7 years ago. What is the biggest difference before and after starting a podcast?
Well, before I was, I'm a retired educator, a teacher and administrator, and I'm used to talking to people, and I'm kind of always inquisitive. And at that time, I thought, wow, I can, podcasting is exploding. Maybe I can make some money. And what I've learned along the way is if you do what you want to do and do it with fidelity, and you do it with integrity, let the chips fall where they may. If you're not making money, so what? If you're happy with what you're doing and you're putting out a quality product, that's what's important. And if you enjoy it, that's great. If it's work and you don't enjoy it, stop doing it.
That's great advice as well for people that are starting, right?
Yes.
Podcasting, if you think that you are going to get rich, or if that's the reason why you're starting a podcast, that's
Yeah,
the wrong reason,
that's
right? Because
correct.
it's not easy to make a living out of podcasting. But if it's something that you love and you want to meet interesting people,
Yes.
then do it, right?
Yes. Yeah, maybe there's another Joe Rogan out there, but not
Yeah.
everybody's going to be that.
hmm where do you see your podcast in 5 years?
Well, I hope we've built up an audience that appreciates what we're doing, and locally and nationally and internationally, because we are listened to internationally, which is really nice to see. So I hope the things that we continue to do will uh, encourage people, educate people, and provide information to people and entertainment even along the way. So that's the goal, is to grow the podcast with individuals who would be not only uh, part of contributing in a listening way, maybe in a monetary way, but also providing some kind of comments that say, "Hey, this is good information, and we enjoy it."
hmm and what is your strategy to get there, to grow your podcast? What do you need to do more?
We're refining a couple things. Number one, I'd like to start doing video when we do the radio, and so I can put that also on utilizing YouTube. That's a strategy. The second thing is to get a little bit more proactive with the social media. It's not been one of my strengths.
Yeah, one thing that we've noticing is that shorts, they work really well,
Hmm.
and they start having a lot of views out of the blue. We just shared one or two shorts, and then YouTube starts publishing it and showing it everywhere, and suddenly we have 1,000, 2,000 people checking out that short. So it's definitely good. Something that PodSquiz can also help with these days. You can also do shorts. You
Exactly.
can also do audiograms. Um, so we are getting towards the end of this episode. If you could give one or two practical tips for a podcaster, either with the stack or how to interview, what would you pick? How would what would those tips be?
I would say a couple things, Tiago. I would say don't get overwhelmed with the hype of equipment and that you have to have all this high quality equipment. Find out what meets your budget. Find good quality. There's good quality things out there that aren't very expensive. Find platforms that work for you and that are easy to work. Some of them can be a little bit more complex than others. And the content is really, to me, the most important thing. Find good content, be a good interview, get out of the way, listen to people, and clean up the audio. And those are the things that I would suggest people do who are getting into this.
And how can someone get better at interviewing?
I think the more you do it, the better you get at it. I would listen to other podcasts also. Some people do a really good job, some don't. Practice with some of your friends, and sit down. How do you talk to people when you're meeting them at the restaurant or at your house, or when you're sitting down and maybe watching a game? How does that interaction and that banter go back and forth? That's the kind of informal thing that people open up more on than a formal quote unquote interview. Have a
Yeah.
conversation.
hmm Yeah, the good thing about being an interviewer is that we get to practice a lot by talking with our loved ones, with our friends.
That's
When we go
correct.
to the groceries, everything, we're always talking and we're always practicing.
Be
So
inquisitive.
exactly, ask questions. Great,
Yes.
Great advice, Arnold.
Thank you.
Where can we find you? Where can we find you? Tell us again the name of the podcast. Tell us everything.
It's St. Louis Intune. It's SAINT, but you can find us at STL Intune. That's STLINTUNE.com on the web.
Perfect. I will also link it in the show notes of this episode.
Thank you,
You so much
Tiago.
for sharing your knowledge with us, Arnold.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Tiago.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.